a nice audience in place and a few people coming in while I make the usual introductions, and really to start by welcoming you all, of course. Many of you are joining us across the weeks now to these ARWA Art, Archaeology in Action lectures, the Art, History and Visual Cultural series. And I'm delighted today to be able to welcome our speaker, who is Glynnis Maynard. Glynnis is a final year PhD student at the University of Oxford, not at Oxford. My deep apologies to you, Glynnis, of course. It's at the other place, the University of Cambridge. And she's researched a fascinating area, multimodality and cultural consensus in depictions of beneficent demons in clay figurines and glyptic of the Neo-Assyrian period. And she's also, apart from, of course, now working on writing up, she's been busy participating in a number of field projects, recently Iraqi Kurdistan, but also in southern Iraq. So getting very experienced in the world of ancient Near Eastern studies, actually on the ground. So thank you so much, Glynnis, for agreeing to give this talk today. And we're all looking forward to hearing about dismantling hierarchical models in Neo-Assyrian visual culture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, for that very nice introduction. And thank you again for inviting me to talk today. Ooh, there we go. So the idea for this paper came from what I perceived at the time to be a disconnect between how scholars increasingly talk about Neo-Assyrian art and the images they were using to elaborate upon their ideas. We know that Neo-Assyrian art, particularly that which is produced and experienced in imperial urban centers, reinforces complex relationships between individuals and social groups, singular places, and collective institutions. Nowadays, this imagery is most often encountered via the over life-size palace reliefs of Assyrian kings and protective creatures, posturing and performing in a strategically constructed but perceptually real environment. Whether by the excavation choices of early Western antiquarians or our subsequent attempts to decode them, imagery from Neo-Assyrian palaces and capitals have come to dominate the field of Neo-Assyrian art history, promoting an enduring research emphasis on what relief art, royal statuary, and palace architecture can tell us about Assyrian kingship. However, despite modern academic consensus that the visual construction of Assyrian kingship and royalty involved many other types of non-monumental art, from stamp seals to ivory-adorned furniture to jewelry, these narratives remain a minority in the research landscape. This talk will therefore reflect upon an adjacent, often implicit, logic that persistently arises when considering relationships between various types of art objects of the period, which is that Neo-Assyrian palace reliefs are conceptualized as the source and inspiration of artistic representation for other types of art objects. This conceptualization arguably emerged from earlier Western art historical expectations placed upon Mesopotamian art, and it can be subtly, if unintentionally, perpetuated by studies on Neo-Assyrian visual culture and/or communication that wholly rely on examples from within a certain type of art object or material. So this talk is an attempt to address some of these phenomena via a case study that complicates such unidirectional narratives of motif transfer. Before I discuss the case study, I think it's useful to first track how earlier art historical scholarship has framed and influenced the study of Mesopotamian and Neo-Assyrian art. My intention is to show that in order to consider Neo-Assyrian art as visual culture, something that, to use Sarah Graff's definition of the term, both bears meaning and participates in making meaning, it requires flattening some of these notions about how Neo-Assyrian art interacts with itself. The study of Mesopotamian art in the 20th century was primarily dictated according to Western art historical taxonomies and theory. Viewed as the historical precursors in a developmental scheme, Mesopotamian and Egyptian art was initially judged based on its degree of conformity to the art of the classical Greek world. As tracked by Alison Carmel Thomason in her 2013 chapter titled The Impact of the Portable, Integrating Minor Arts into the Ancient Near Eastern Canon, Neo-Assyrian sculpture and wall reliefs were neatly slotted into a major conception of relative artistic value and stacked, subconsciously or otherwise, at the apex of period-specific mid-20th century surveys of Mesopotamian art, upholding an aesthetic hierarchy determined during the Renaissance that elevated architecture, painting, and sculpture above all other forms of human artistic output. On the left is part of the table of contents from Henri Frankfurt's The Art and Architecture of the Ancient Orient, where his discussion of each time period is organized from monumental to non-monumental, large to small. General surveys of Western art history, such as Gardner's Art Through the Ages, which I used in my Art History 101 class in undergrad, favor iconic selections of Mesopotamian art that overwhelmingly fall into sculptural or architectural categories and are often objects acquired by Western museums pre-World War II. On the right is a table created by Amy Gansel and Ann Schaefer in their recent edited volume on the canon of ancient Near Eastern art and archaeology, which lists the top works of Mesopotamian art and architecture that appear in college textbooks. Only 3 of these are small scale: the bull lyre, the uruk-head, and the Eshnunna votives, and all except the bull lyre conform to either architectural or sculptural examples. Objects which have been traditionally coded as minor, such as cylinder seals, clay figurines, ivory plaques, and ceramics, either by virtue of smaller scale or mode of creation, are also sometimes designated in the literature as craft. This artificial coding meant that crafts, as opposed to true works of art, were evaluated on the basis of production and utility, rather than as objects to be approached for their aesthetic or affective value. Even within the minor arts, there are hierarchies of perceived value. So cylinder seals and ivories, which are formed of luxury materials and are often treated as individual works of art, have received more art historical attention than objects like clay plaques and pottery, which are coded as domestic crafts with standardized means of replication. While recently there has been an uptick in research on these comparatively underrepresented categories, there remains a persistent disconnect between the perceived ability of minor arts to act as an influence on the major arts. I should say that recent art historical scholarship has been more self-critical in acknowledging the anachronistic and obstructive effects of Western art historical expectations on ancient West Asian art. Moving beyond this analytical barrier, Thomason proposed using the terms portable and non-portable, which do not play into the same value systems as major and minor or monumental and non-monumental. Although this formulation is also structured by familiar Western taxonomies such as scale, technique, and material, traditional indicators used to signal relevant artistic or social value, the dichotomy of portable and non-portable prioritizes the choices and behaviors humans make when producing and consuming objects. This dialectical interaction, I feel, poses a useful point of analysis in studies of visual culture and communication, where between producers and consumers, portable and non-portable objects are equally suited to influence human choices and behaviors. Outside of art historical circles, Assyriologists and historians have long demonstrated the importance of portable objects. In particular, the continuous use of seals as sealing technologies throughout Mesopotamian political history have helped facilitate administrative, economic, and political control across increasingly expansive geographical territories. For example, Karen Radner has shown how bureau seals from the Neo-Assyrian period regulated the use of specific visual motifs to legitimate business and correspondence conducted on behalf of the king, queen, crown prince, and magnates, particularly in the 7th century BCE. So this slide shows the 4 types described by Radner, although there are certainly more to be identified. From the left, there is the king killing a lion motif for administrative activities related to the king's bureau, the scorpion motif to denote activities taking place involving the queen's household, the tripled kingship motif combined with 3 alternating Y shapes known as ispulortu to indicate the bureau of the crown prince, and the mace, which occurs as a stamp sealing concurrently with the personal cylinder sealings of Nimrud governors, possibly from the same stamp cylinder. It has so far been associated with Bel-Tartsi-Uluma, governor during the reign of Adad-Nirari III, and Sharu-Duri, governor during the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III. So the visual system in which the exercise of Assyrian kingship and authority was partially made manifest clearly extended beyond the confines of monumental art and architecture. So how have these hierarchical legacies influenced knowledge production regarding Neo-Assyrian art? The first analyses on Neo-Assyrian visual communication as we know it began with how palace relief programs or royal sculpture relate to imperial ideologies. Many of these foundational arguments were formulated in the late 1970s and 1980s, and understood Neo-Assyrian political history as primarily rooted in the actions of a single individual, the king. Consequently, studies on palace relief programs focused on the relationship between state propaganda, historical narrative, and royal ideology. As their stated focus, these studies predominantly considered royal sculptural programs and architecture as the categories from which to form their arguments about the nature of royal visual communication. While more recent treatments focus on other aspects, such as narrative strategies or artistic production, they nevertheless build on these earlier iconographic interpretations. Only seldom do studies read against the outright political functioning of palace reliefs, such as Mehmet Ali Ataç's esoteric semiotics in the mythology of kingship in Neo-Assyrian art. Similar to how scholarship on Neo-Assyrian relief art tends to preserve its own autonomy, Diana Stein has recently argued that seals have also historically been treated as a canonical, self-contained body of evidence. Moreover, she maintains that seals remain separate but occasionally useful to the study of archaeology, texts, and other types of art. Inclusive approaches to first millennium BCE West Asian visual culture, which seek to connect the varied roles of images across materials, remain atypical, such as Christoph Uhlinger's edited volume on images as media from 2000. When Neo-Assyrian art specialists do consider visual relationships across formal categories, scale remains an influential factor of analysis in determining vectors of transmission. Earlier research has tended to identify stone relief or sculpture as the original influencers from which other objects draw their inspiration. In her foundational paper on Neo-Assyrian cylinder seals, published in Uhlinger's Images as Media volume, Irene Winter proposed a hierarchical image system for iconography found on both cylinder seals and royal palace reliefs, where seal holders operating in official political or administrative capacities choose motifs found on palace reliefs in order to reference the kingly person via visual association. Winter examined multiple types of seal motifs, ranging from bull hunts to attendants flanking a sacred tree, and suggested that they ultimately originated from Ashurbanipal II's Northwest Palace reliefs at Nimrud. She noted that the direction of imagery found on seals is often the opposite to that of the reliefs, as if the motif had been seen on the reliefs, then copied directly onto the seal, such as the impression would produce the reversed image. And this could in turn suggest that the palace was a conscious source for the iconography of the seals. On this basis, she advanced the notion of a hierarchy within Neo-Assyrian art, in which sculpture in relief or in the round ultimately determines the choice and appearance of visual content in other forms. At the pinnacle of this system of visual production is the Assyrian king, whose artistic output, reliefs, statuary, form the basis for subsequent output in other media used by members of his court. Her proposal, while likely true in particular cases, somewhat masks the overall potential of cylinder seals to act as effective carriers of iconographic motifs, and perhaps overemphasizes the role of palace relief art across the roughly 3 centuries of Neo-Assyrian visual culture. We know that cylinder and stamp seals are incredibly useful vehicles for spreading highly specific visual motifs, in both iconic and narrative form, arguably more so than imagery stationed inside temples and palaces. Whether impressed or rolled, ceilings were used at local and regional scales, from securing containers for transport, blocking storage rooms, legitimizing contracts and bills of sale, or personalizing correspondence. The infinite possibilities of image replication over time and space distributes agency of not only the image itself, but also of the person to whom the seal is attached. In the Neo-Assyrian period, personal inscriptions on cylinder seals are quite rare, and instead the proliferation of recognizable, even standardized iconographies seem to have been an effective mode of communication on behalf of individuals and institutions involved in political governance. More recently, Davide Nadali has shown that the numerous stamp seals featuring the Assyrian king stabbing a lion used in royal administration had the opposite effect as described by Winter. In fact, certain impressed examples of this motif appear earlier on clay bullae used to seal various containers and goods, approximately 60 years before its possible replication on a palace relief from Nineveh. Nadali argues that certain lions on Ashurbanipal's North Palace hunt reliefs directly borrow from the arrangement and pose of lions on state administrative stamp seals. Although Winter interestingly mentions this exact opposite possibility in a footnote of her Palais Imaginaire paper, she still grounds her overall argument in the belief that in the shared visual environment of palace reliefs and cylinder/stamp seals, it is the former that determines the latter. Nevertheless, Nadali's argument and Winter's mention pose a useful thread of counter-narrative against visual communication as a trickle-down phenomenon, where motifs from royal relief programs or other non-portable objects are either reworked or directly copied by artisans onto smaller objects, which then sort of percolate through society and into Neo-Assyrian culture. While this argument may indeed hold true for certain examples, its tendency to be implicitly framed as such in Neo-Assyrian art historical discourse risks unconsciously strengthening these lingering Western hierarchical classifications of the monumental and non-monumental, or the major and the minor. So in this talk, I consider cylinder seals and their accompanying impressions equally capable of producing visual or intellectual influence as palace relief programs, so long as they contain the qualities valued by its makers and users within Neo-Assyrian society. Indeed, Mesopotamian aesthetic criteria did not inherently privilege one type of material or object category over another, but instead assigned value relative to visual and emotional response. The perceived value of objects, and/or the images on them, was reliant on a blend of form, function, and material, from the degree to which they were skillfully made into a pleasing form, on their degree of ability to affect the material world around them, and on the value ascribed to the single or series of materials used to make them. Akkadian terminology used to describe visual or emotional satisfaction resulting from an object or image can be applicable to either human or non-human subjects. And I feel this is a point worth thinking about. Due to the wide proliferation of human and non-human subjects in Neo-Assyrian art, there is potentially a diverse pool of relevant imagery that could have influenced the composition of subject matter on Neo-Assyrian palace reliefs. To briefly revisit the visual example of attendants flanking the sacred tree, most famously known by the throne room reliefs in Ashurbanipal's palace at Nimrud, it is worth thinking a bit through Winter's claim of a hierarchy of genres. In a hierarchical model of visual influence, artisans who work in royal workshops essentially disseminate imagery associated with palace and temple contexts out to a larger number of people. Court scholars and master craftsmen are often cited as responsible alongside the king for the layout and content of Neo-Assyrian palace relief programs. I would argue that the Neo-Assyrian king and his surrounding administration are thus imagined as affective and not affected by this dissemination, not painted as avid consumers of this visual culture, but only as originators or influencers. If we take a look at cylinder seals with this type of composition, we can see that faithful replication of Ashurnasirpal's palace reliefs, such as the example in the top left, is the exception rather than the norm. There are instead a wide range of motifs employed, including human and non-human worshippers, along with different types of the sacred tree, that likely signal diverse interpretations of a highly complex theme. It is with these reflections in mind that I introduce the main case study of this presentation, which revisits visual relationships between cylinder seals and palace reliefs. The animals and themes I have chosen are special in that they appear at multiple scales on both cylinder seals and stone reliefs in the Neo-Assyrian period. The lion in the context of royal hunts, and the monster Anzu in mythological representations. The following discussion tracks reciprocity between these creatures via visual composition and figural gesture to show that later palace relief programs, particularly those of Ashurbanipal, may have deliberately borrowed from earlier cylinder seal imagery in crafting depictions that cement deep links between royal and mythological power. So lion hunting as a visual corpus has a rich history in Mesopotamia extending back into the Uruk period. By the Neo-Assyrian period, it is clear that this theme was conceptualized at multiple scales and in various guises, not only featuring in the context of relief art and administrative practices, but also as depictions on ivory panels and arguably alluded to in the addition of lion paws to things like furniture and offering tables. Anzu imagery, while attested on cylinder seals and temple reliefs, is less studied for the Neo-Assyrian period, in part due to hesitancy and identification, with greater attention paid to its appearance in textual sources. Its early dynastic predecessor, the Imdegod, has a more secure visual identification, appearing as a heraldic bird with a lion head across southern Mesopotamia, including the stele of the vultures at Girsu and on a copper frieze adorning the temple of Ninhursag at Tel el-Ubaid. It is still unclear exactly when and how the form of this monster shifted between the 3rd and 1st millennium, and judging from Neo-Assyrian royal inscriptions, such as the one on the slide describing Esarhaddon's building works at Arbela, modern Erbil, we are missing images of Anzu that may have given additional clues regarding the development of its iconography. Despite the concomitant appearance of lions in the Anzu in similar context of Neo-Assyrian image consumption and proposed textual parallels between descriptions of royal lion hunts and the Anzu myth, which I will touch upon in a minute, comparatively little has been done in considering any concrete visual relationship between the two subjects. In order to do this, I will first briefly detail the current understanding of Ashurbanipal's lion hunt reliefs. So Ashurbanipal's North Palace, built between 646 and 643 BCE, was the last in a series of Sargonid capital palaces built on the Nineveh citadel. While it is only partially excavated and remains somewhat poorly understood, the North Palace nevertheless retained the royal Neo-Assyrian aesthetic tradition of lining its corridors and rooms with relief panels. Reliefs depicting scenes of lion hunts are located in room C, which was a connecting corridor from the central courtyard, and in the western portico that included entrance room S and S1, which was some type of architectural space possibly located above room S at ground level. While these rooms were visible in the sense that viewers would have presumably encountered this imagery when either entering the palace from an external area or inner courtyard, it remains difficult to pinpoint the actual or intended audiences of the North Palace reliefs. Some areas of the palace could have functioned more publicly, receiving foreign dignitaries or envoys bearing tribute, while other spaces could have been reserved for the king and his household, as well as for members of the political administration, including magnates and scribes. This distinction between outsiders and insiders has led some scholars to postulate that in Ashurnasirpal's earlier Northwest Palace reliefs at Nimrud, the primary audience was the king and court officials who were responsible for creating and shaping the imagery itself. By the time of Ashurbanipal, relief art had at least 200 years to develop in complexity, and it is possible that esoteric interpretations remain throughout the development of Neo-Assyrian visual historical narratives, albeit articulated differently than in previous palace relief programs. To that end, scholarship on Ashurbanipal's lion reliefs has mainly sought to establish how best to read and understand this imagery. The visual construction of Ashurbanipal's roles in the lion hunts has been broadly examined. Chikako Watanabe suggests that continuous interplay between linear and centric narratives are intended to create a semi-historical, strategically constructed picture of Assyrian kingship and royal ritual. Visual accounts of Ashurbanipal's lion hunts reflect both a linear progression of events, best seen in sequences of caged to killed lion, or in viewing registers from top to bottom, in addition to centric arrangements composed of multiple events performing outside of historical time, which emphasize the king's divinely bestowed ability to impose order over a chaotic environment, here personified by the lion. These reliefs may have even commemorated a particular royal lion hunt that took place in an arena at Nineveh. Lions on the reliefs are further examined as tragic heroes, in emotional relation to the king in the hunt narrative. Additional attention has been drawn to the imaginative portrayal of defeated lions, in which they are shown bleeding out onto the earth or coughing up blood, relating this to a uniquely Assyrian brand of comic horror, also seen in the torture of Assyrian prisoners. Negative, violent imagery in general, of which Neo-Assyrian palace reliefs are well versed, can also act as neurological stimuli, capturing the attention and recollection of viewers. Regarding the thematic interpretation of Ashurbanipal's lion reliefs, Watanabe and Amr Anus have drawn connections to the Akkadian Anzu myth. In the Anzu myth, Anzu is a lion bird with the head, forelegs, and body of a lion, and the wings, hind leg talons, and feathered tail of a bird. It is initially a trusted doorkeeper of the god Enlil, but one day Anzu steals Enlil's tablet of destinies, which contains the power and secrets of Enlil, or Enlilship, and carries the tablet away to its mountain lair. Enlil asks Adad, then Gira, then Shara to retrieve his tablet, and they all refuse, before finally Ninurta agrees to go. After a dramatic battle, Ninurta shoots Anzu with a few arrows, cuts off its wings, and retrieves the tablet of destinies for Enlil, thereby restoring the natural order of things. While this paper proposes that there is a more concrete visual rather than just textual relationship between hunted lions and the hunted Anzu, Watanabe and Anus mainly cite intertextual relationships between the myth and Assyrian royal inscriptions. There are three suggested connections. Firstly, a gish Naramtu, a special weapon used to kill lions, is attested on the broken obelisk, which describes the military campaigns of the Middle Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser I. So in column 4, lines 9 through 12, it reads, 120 lions with his courageous heart and with his mighty attack, both in his open chariot and on foot, he slew with the spear, and he brought down a number of lions with Naramtu weapons. Naramtu, itself a rare word, stems from the equally rare verb ru'umu, to cut off, which is used in the Akkadian Anzu myth to describe Ninurta's action of cutting off Anzu's wings. Secondly, Assyrian kings hunted lions in special open chariots, gishgigir patute, described in numerous royal inscriptions, such as the one on the banquet stele of Ashurbanipal II. Through dominating the bodies of dangerous animals like the wild bull and lion, Ashurnasirpal mimics the heroic actions of the patron god of his new capital city at Nimrud, Ninurta. Similarly, in the Sumerian Angim hymn, Ninurta returns to Nippur in his shining chariot with the bodies of 11 conquered monsters. Such narrative parallels help to establish deep conscious links, not only with literary tradition, but also between royal and divine bodies. Thirdly, Ashurbanipal is shown on his palace reliefs hunting on foot, and earlier Neo-Assyrian royal inscriptions describe hunting lions in ashepia lasamate, on my swift feet. The use of the word lasamatu is similarly associated with the cultic Lismu foot race that commemorates Ninurta's victory over Anzu. These intertextual examples suggest that beyond merely hunting lions, Ashurbanipal is also connecting his exercise of kingship to that of Ninurta's actions in the Anzu myth. Watanabe also mentions that the lion can be a textual metaphor for mythological figures, including Anzu and other enemies of Ninurta, a scapegoat whose defeat endorses the overarching royal narrative of imposing order over chaos. I should mention that such allusions to literary works are also argued to be apparent elsewhere amongst the palace reliefs at Nineveh. For example, the parallel between the treatment of Humbaba's head from tablet 5 of the Epic of Gilgamesh and the transport of the Elamite king to Uman's head in Ashurbanipal's Battle of Tultuba reliefs from Sennacherib's Southwest Palace. To quote Dominic Bonatz's 2004 paper, the transport of the severed head over a long distance, the triumphal return with it to Nineveh, and its consecration to the gods recall the epic story in which Gilgamesh returned to Nippur with the head of Humbaba and booty from the Cedar Mountain. Like Ashurbanipal, who consecrated the head of Teuman to his gods in Nineveh, Gilgamesh consecrated the head of Humbaba to Enlil and Nippur. The connotations of the severed head must have made it quite easy for the Assyrian audience to associate the image of the victorious king with that of the heroic demon slayer in the Gilgamesh epic. So one common thread throughout these iconographical and thematic explanations is the central importance of Ashurbanipal, from his explicit actions to minute changes in dresses and accoutrements between relief panels, as informing and driving the overall meaning of his lion hunt reliefs. But what about the other main protagonist on these reliefs, or from an Assyrian perspective, the antagonist? Apart from describing these lions as comically horrific or heroically emotive, how else might artistic decisions of physical gesture or motion and compositional arrangement inform our understanding of these reliefs? Most importantly for this talk, how can some of Ashurbanipal's lions relate to Anzu? When scholars do point out any visual examples of the Anzu myth in this study's context, they cite its appearance generally on Neo-Assyrian linear-style cylinder seals of the 9th and 8th centuries, and specifically on a relief at the entrance of the Ninurta temple at Nimrud. This temple relief is usually described as the blueprint for like cylinder seals and is the predominant visual Anzu source cited in Neo-Assyrian art publications. Such citations of Anzu imagery in relation to the lion reliefs are seemingly made at a thematic level, but when comparing visual examples of Anzu on cylinder seals with the Ninurta temple relief, they are actually quite different. This consistent reference to the temple relief perhaps reveals more about lingering art historical practice to cite visual relationships from within the same material corpus, here being relief, rather than across them. The Ninurta temple relief, which likely depicts Ninurta battling with Anzu, arranges Anzu such that its body is in profile, wings behind its body and forelegs in front, as it twists its neck backwards to roar at its assailant. We can see this Anzu pose also on a Neo-Assyrian official cylinder seal, inscribed with the name of Ishtar Balata Eresh, governor of Kilitsu, a provincial city in the Assyrian heartland. As opposed to the relief, on seals, the striding figure of Ninurta usually stands on a similar griffin-like creature who is differentiated from Anzu by a scorpion tail. Ursula Seidel has convincingly argued that this is the Abubu, a creature representing the deluge who aids Ninurta in his hunt. Since Anzu and the Abubu are both related to destructive weather phenomena, their related iconography is likely deliberate. However, the composition of the Anzu on most linear-style cylinder seals diverges slightly from the oft-cited Ninurta temple example and could represent an alternative conceptualization of Anzu's actions in the Ninurta Anzu myth. On these seals, the Anzu's hind legs are shown in profile, and its wings and forelegs separate from each other and fully extend to either side of its body. Of the examples I have located which have the complete triad of Ninurta, Abubu, and Anzu, 12 follow this composition, whereas only 6 examples could be said to directly replicate the positioning of Anzu from the Ninurta temple relief. An additional 3 examples show Anzu completely face or run from the advancing figure of Ninurta, so there is no twisting in the body. In incomplete scenes on cylinder seals, which do not include the Abubu, and therefore could be said to replicate the composition in the temple relief more closely, the form of Anzu instead matches the positioning seen on this slide. This positioning is unique amongst winged creatures in Neo-Assyrian art, and wings depicted as such are usually reserved for anthropomorphic figures and deities. Moreover, the positioning of the rest of the body is now ambiguous. Are we supposed to be looking at Anzu's chest or at Anzu's back? There appears to be limited attempts to render shoulder blades on the seal at the lower left, and a later 8th century example on the right shows Anzu's left wing clearly emerging from its back. Anzu's pose heightens the tension of the overall scene, capturing the moment at which Ninurta surprises Anzu with the decisive arrow. This presentation of the back is actually highly unusual in Neo-Assyrian art, which favors figural composition that is fully in profile or twisted at the waist to present the torso and face frontally, or torso frontally but face in profile. A few examples depict figures fully frontal, such as the 4-winged female deity, possibly a version of Ishtar that is a popular choice on stamp seals of the time. When figures are winged, they either present themselves frontally or appear in profile. Profile perspective is almost always used for human figures on palace reliefs, for example, Ashurbanipal post-lion hunt. In comparison to other hunt or combat scenes on cylinder seals, the hunted animal is typically shown in profile, as seen on the right. Its neck will often twist around to look over its shoulder away from or at the back of its pursuer, which is more accurate to the physical arrangement of the Anzu from the Ninurta temple. However, on the dominant version of Anzu seals, Anzu twists its entire upper body to directly look at and confront its opponent, emphasizing its impressive wingspan while presenting its back, as if to foreshadow the impending loss of its wings. To my knowledge, the only other creatures to be composed in such a way, and perhaps mirroring or referencing this unique pose, are particular lions on Ashurbanipal's relief program. Indeed, the rampant and splayed dying lion between 2 chariots in room C shows this correspondence at its largest scale. Taking up the majority of the southwest wall, this composition is described by Watanabe as difficult to make sense of from the point of view of time and space in reality. Ashurbanipal, who is shown twice in separate chariots on either side of this lion, is practically a supporting character for the central lion in this type of composition. The arrangement of this lion between 2 chariots echoes other heraldic compositions in Neo-Assyrian art, including 3-figure contest scenes on cylinder seals and the sacred tree relief from Ashurnasirpal's throne room. Its body twists aggressively at its middle, presenting its back and modeled shoulder blades to the viewer. The strong articulation of each digit of the forepaws as they spread out into empty space is also paralleled in Anzu seal imagery. Although Ashurbanipal is hunting from each approaching chariot with either a sword or a spear, it is an arrow through the face that is the principal demise of this particular lion. In this specific case, perhaps another reference to the defeat of Anzu beyond hunting lions with arrows. Exploring such visual relationships between cylinder seals and palace reliefs can help unpack social relationships between aesthetic producers and consumers. How did individuals, either loosely or directly affiliated with the institution of Assyrian kingship, interact with and/or contribute to the ongoing production and development of motifs within Neo-Assyrian art? Dominique Collin has remarked that on surviving inscribed seals and impressions of inscribed seals, Ninurta is the most frequently depicted deity, and Kazuko Watanabe has similarly noted the popularity of Ninurta imagery on official seals, precisely because of the connection in political ideology between royal lion hunts and Ninurta hunting Anzu. In their recent PhD dissertation on depictions of divine combat in first millennium Southwest Asia, Madad Ritchie posits that the figure of Ninurta on such seals might equally be associated with the figure of the Assyrian ruler, further deepening the theological beliefs and political commitments of the seal owner to the ruling body. Of our inscribed examples, most belong to individuals either explicitly named in political administration and governance, or whose skills were used in a Neo-Assyrian court context. So on the top left, we have Ninurta Bel Utsur, Sa Reshi, or court eunuch to Ninurta Ashared, who was eponym in 812 BCE, Ishtar Balatu Eresh, Rabalani, or governor of Kilitsu, Bel Imurani, who is perhaps identified with one of three eponyms, so Retsapa in 737 BCE, Carchemish in 691 BCE, or possibly as a Turtanu or military officer in 686 BCE, and Yapa Hadu, whose Aramaic inscription names them as a dream interpreter. One rather interesting Babylonian votive example belonged to one Nabu Etir, a Paktu official with a later inscription added by Iriba Marduk, who was either father or grandfather to the Babylonian ruler Marduk Appa Adina II. Whether this mythological scene was the personal choice of these individuals, or perhaps indicative of a more widely adopted composition amongst those involved in political administration, it is not yet known. But it is the impressed version of Anzu on these seals that particular lines on the North Palace reliefs match most closely. Winter's argument was that cylinder seals with imagery complementary to palace reliefs show the same scene in reverse, as if the seal maker saw a relief and copied it directly onto the seal surface, producing a reverse impression. If the planners of Ashurbanipal's reliefs previously experienced this Anzu type impressed into clay, the near-exact copying of pose from seal impression to palace relief would suggest conscious emulation of the seal impression, using Winter's logic. This would also seem to complement Nadali's argument that the North Palace reliefs directly copied or indirectly referenced older images on stamp seals, which already had established connotations of royal power in the layout of various lines in the hunt scenes. While I have yet to find examples of inscribed cylinder seal impressions containing the Anzu scene on surviving documents, in part because tablets with seal impressions from before the late 8th century are practically non-existent, it would seem to suggest that this particular image of Anzu must have been circulated to some degree, to the point where those determining the composition of figures on the North Palace reliefs were familiar with its unique pose. A fragmentary limestone plaque found at Nineveh, tentatively dated to the 9th to 8th centuries BCE, could be an example of such a vector. Originally, perhaps 30 by 18 centimeters, its portability could have eased the distribution of its visual program, and recalls the off-cited hypothesis of pattern books to explain how motifs were circulated among artisans and workshops. Depicting on one side the lower half of a striding god atop the remaining upper half of a winged creature, with a smaller figure to the right in a similar striding pose, Julian Reed interprets this scene as a partial model for the Ninurta Abubu Anzu composition found on cylinder seals of the same period. However, Reed perpetuates a hierarchical notion of scale by arguing that the plaque implies the existence of larger versions of the Ninurta Abubu Anzu scene, from which the makers of cylinder seals could have drawn their imagery. Regardless of whether such larger examples may have once existed, it should not automatically follow that monumentality dictates the direction of motif transfer. It is unfortunate that we are missing the Anzu on this plaque to see whether its form matched the posture found on the majority of relevant cylinder seals, or whether it was arranged more in line with the one from the Ninurta temple at Nimrud. Nevertheless, I would argue that the twisting and backwards composition of Anzu on cylinder seals could have communicated a powerful visual message separate from familiarity with Anzu in text and oral sources, resonating with the individuals responsible for palace relief design. If this were an image associated with the personal and/or professional actions of government officials, its metaphorical inclusion on Ashurbanipal's reliefs could suggest a strategic choice in co-opting a pose identifiable to particular members of his court. Utilized in this way across multiple visual scales, this imagery has the capacity to create and activate specific relationships between the gods, the Assyrian king, and members of his court, as recently argued in the case of Ashurnazirpal's palace reliefs by Paul Collins. Understood thusly, seal imagery is not merely referential to palace reliefs and/or the kingly person, as famously argued by Winter, but could be a reference in and of itself. Indeed, the king and his court complex, composed of family members and scholarly officials, would understand this type of imagery in a more nuanced way than outside visitors. While the occasional outsider might read these lion reliefs as a series of lion hunts, those who frequent the palace might recognize the message of Assyrian kingship, and still others might identify a relationship to Ninurta and Anzu through recognition of this visual covalence between certain lions and the Anzu. Therefore, I suggest that this pose establishes a deliberate iconic orientation from hunted lions to the Anzu within particular vignettes amongst the wider lion hunt relief program. The composition of Ashurbanipal chariot lion, crafted on the southwest wall of room C, and Ninurta Abubu Anzu on 9th and 8th century linear style cylinder seals carry the same visual structure, allowing for implicit connection between these two compositions, cemented by the distinctive posture of the lion and the Anzu. A simpler example of visual quotation is the repetition of gesture seen in the example above. As Ashurnasirpal II returns from campaign on a relief from the Northwest Palace, he mirrors the pose of a god in the winged disc located directly above him. Ludovico Portuese has also drawn attention to the intericonic or interpictorial qualities of Neo-Assyrian palace reliefs, focusing on the conscious emulation and transformation of Ashurnasirpal II's lion hunts, seen here on the left, into Ashurbanipal's relief program on the right. Composition, pose, and gesture is not a new framework of study for Neo-Assyrian reliefs, but it has overwhelmingly focused on human figures in the narrative. If we take these same observations made of human figures and apply them to non-human actors, we can see a similar system of referential composition at work. As this observation relates to pictorial strategies of narration, the lion here acts as an emblematic substitution of the Anzu, functioning inside the larger continuous narratives of Ashurbanipal's lion hunts. Conceptualizing the production of image systems in Neo-Assyrian art as a blend of iconicity and narrative has already been acknowledged by scholars. These methods of strategic signification allowed for multi-layered possibilities of interpretation, ones that are experienced by different types of people with varying levels of cultural knowledge. Interestingly, this type of visual play also arguably occurs among cylinder seals at a compositional level in which figures are substituted in mythological scenes. Anthony Green cites an example of this substitution from another of the few identifiable mythological scenes in Mesopotamian art, that of Gilgamesh and Enkidu slaying the monster Humbaba. On a 9th and 8th century BCE Chalcedonian cylinder seal from Ashur, seen on the left, Gilgamesh and Enkidu flank Humbaba on either side, and Humbaba is shown kneeling, facing frontally. A later 8th to 7th century cylinder seal, unfortunately unprovenanced, shows a strikingly similar composition, except that each figure is substituted by a Kusariku bullman, Lachmu, hairy, and Gurtabulu, scorpion man, respectively. Green suggests that this substitution is a sort of humorous visual play, one that would have been recognizable to and enjoyable for ancient viewers who were familiar with Gilgamesh's exploits. Viewed thusly, the correspondence between particular lions in Anzu and Ashurbanipal's lion reliefs may have been a visual pun for members of Ashurbanipal's inner court. What is particularly interesting to me is that neither Neo-Assyrian royal seals nor bureau seals use mythological iconography, but rather it is the seals of court officials that employ such motifs in various ways. Beneath the upper echelons of activities conducted on behalf of royals and high officials, there appears to be a dynamic visual landscape constituted by the personal seals of officials and courtiers, likely influenced by, but contributing to the production of court-centered art, which by extension includes the play and display of scholarly knowledge. To conclude, moving beyond identifying individual examples of visual metaphor and intericonicity requires thinking about how Neo-Assyrian visual culture might function as a coded visual system. The inherent polysemic nature of the above imagery, developed throughout the timeline of Neo-Assyrian art, implies a codification of visual conventions and representational strategies for depicting images. While cuneiform writing as a polysemic system is clearly known, studies which discuss the potential of polysemy in visual imagery have only really emerged in the past few years. Polysemy relies on a varied interplay between mental and material images. For instance, Karen Sonic discusses the image of Ninurta and Anzu from the Nimrud temple as a polysemic image that simultaneously embodies multiple versions of Ninurta in written sources, including his appearances as a famous monster wrangler, a hero god extraordinaire, and also as a model of human kingship. Polysemy also activates temporal and geographic scales, which is clear from the presented case study. Its correspondences can be diverse, shifting from simple to complex quotation, transformation, and the readaptation of imagery. So the suggested relationship between Anzu imagery on early Neo-Assyrian cylinder seals, and particular lions on Ashurbanipal's North Palace reliefs, questions traditional assumptions regarding visual motif transfer in the Neo-Assyrian period. Not only does it imply the strategic adaptation of imagery from an earlier portable context, but it also points towards a system of representation which knowingly plays with composition, iconicity, and gesture across human and animal categories. Far from being solely applicable to humans and the gods, monsters and animals also participate in this flexible making of meaning. There should not be a fixed sovereignty of interpretation from our perspective, but rather many possible correct interpretations of a given motif or composition, operating from within a dynamic visual environment, capable of carrying multiple communicative messages to its recipients. This is not to deny the central performance and communication of Assyrian kingship in Ashurbanipal's reliefs. Rather, it is simply to suggest that Neo-Assyrian visual communication has the capacity to be consciously multi-layered for a heterogeneous audience. We should not think of palace relief programs as the sole originators of Neo-Assyrian image production and consumption, but rather as merely one mode of visual expression, one that operates from within a complex web of social, intellectual, and material production, capable of being as affected as it is effective. Thank you.
Glynnis, thank you very much indeed. That was a wonderful talk, and really brought to life, I think, that idea of a web of interconnections across this visual language. So brilliant, thank you. And lots of virtual hand clapping as well, as one might expect. So thank you. So an opportunity, if anyone has any questions now, to ask Glynnis, or perhaps share some thoughts and ideas. You should have access to both your video and microphone, but if not, could raise your hand, but otherwise just do say. Joanne, please.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can hear very well.
Okay, and I'm unable to start my video, but it doesn't matter. Start my video. Okay, great. Okay. Wait a minute. Okay. I'm not seeing myself, but anyway, it's okay.
You're visible to us.
I'm visible to you. Okay, well, that's good. All right. Basically, brava. This is wonderful. I wanted to tell you that from the research that I've been working on, there is a fairly direct connection actually between Anzu and the lion hunts. And I can tell you, I'm hopefully going to be publishing all of this at some point, but what I can tell you, because it's already sort of out there, is that in the Enema Elish, the defeat of Anzu, the reference, talks about red rain.
Interesting. Okay.
The red rain.
Mm-hmm.
So that tells you that the rains start in the fall. They stop in the spring and they start in the fall. So the defeat of Anzu, mythologically, is bringing about the coming of the fall rains, which are red rain because there's dust in the air.
Okay.
Then fills it up. This is De Moore talking in Ugarit, his wonderful thing on the Baal epic, talks about that, that you actually have red rain. And they've had it in California, I think now, there's been red rain. Anyway, that's what's going on with that. All right, so that's a fall event. Now, the part that is a little bit further along, but I will eventually be trying to ground this, so I'll just give it to you on a platter, is that what I see in the lion reliefs followed by the scene where they're partying, they connect up, as you know, is a trope which originates in Iran, but talks about the fall, a battle in the summer, actually bringing about the fall rains eventually in the fall. Okay, so you have then the lion hunt itself is something which is going to be bringing the fall rain. So the referencing of the lion looking like Anzu, so shooting him through the head is the sort of direct equivalent, shall we say, of the mythological shooting of Anzu through his head. Okay, so that I think links up very nicely to what you're saying. But at any rate, I can't promise that I'll be publishing this anytime soon, but eventually it will be there to support.
Well, I will certainly look for it. Thank you.
Oh, just one other point I wanted to make is that the privacy of remember that there are Elamites in the corner of the scene for the banqueting. So there are, I won't say this was a public event because it obviously was not, but that there are invited guests.
Okay.
Who are foreigners, potentially embassy and, ambassadors from foreign countries, this kind of thing, and people who are, prisoners in the court or whatever. Okay. So I just wanted to point that out, that it's a slightly larger audience than just private, just from the relief itself. So
okay, yeah, thank you.
I can also have a lot more to say on that subject, but again, this is coming attraction. So anyway.
No, thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And well, there'll be future, hopefully, series of talks where we can hear it at length. So that's great. Thank you so much for those thoughts. Are there any other comments, questions, thoughts? No one
Bullshit.
immediately.
Yeah, I know you are. That and 1,000 other things.
Very good. Well, in which case then, let me just say a few words about next week's talk. We have 2 more in the current series, and next week will be Kirsten Neumann from the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures in Chicago. And she will be looking at, her title is Beyond Impression, looking at steels of the Neo-Assyrian period. So I look forward very much to seeing many of you the same time, same place next week. But it just leaves me to again thank Glynnis Maynard for really terrific talk and opening up so many avenues of possibility of rethinking those relationships between the portable and non-portable. So Glynnis, thank you very much indeed. And
thank you so much, Paul.
Again.